Is Tim Piles in here? Raise your hand. Are you here? I don't see him. Does anybody see him? Oh, there is Sam. Yeah. Hey, I didn't know that I was sitting by you on that plane a couple of years ago. You should have said something. You know, it's a little irritating to listen to a little guy like that talk about plane accommodations. Do you have any idea what a plane is like? Usually, and it may have been him, there's a little guy sitting in front of me, and I am pushed in my seat as far as I can get, and my knees are still in the back of the seat in front of me, and they recline. Yeah, that wasn't you, was it? Well, next time that happens, I'll read the Beatitudes, I'll tell you that. It's good to be here. This is a great event, and I always leave here feeling better and encouraged and renewed, and I want to thank everybody here. I know that so many people are involved in pulling this off, and it means a lot to me, and I know it means a lot to a lot of folks, and thank all of you who are behind the scenes making this happen. It was time for the Feast of Tabernacles. And Jesus' own brothers were not believers at this time. And it was time to go to Jerusalem. And the brothers sarcastically said, well, why don't you go on down to Judea, go to Jerusalem, go to the feast. They knew that they wanted to kill Jesus. In Judea, they were waiting for Jesus to come. And Jesus said, well, no, I'm not going to do that. My time is not at hand yet. And so the brothers went on down to Jerusalem, and then Jesus came down later after the feast had already begun, and he tried to just kind of slip in the back door, if you will. He tried to be secretive or quiet and private about his coming, but it didn't take long. Word got out, Jesus is in town. So that caused the chief priests and the Pharisees to gather together, and they decided to get some men to go arrest Jesus and bring him to them. And they probably had plans of putting Jesus to death. Well, the men went and they came back to the chief priest and the scribes in John chapter 7, and they said, where is he? Because they had come back empty-handed. And they said, well, where is he? And they began to berate these guards who had gone to arrest him, and they began to ridicule them and belittle them and said, what? I mean, are you guys disciples now too? Did you go and did he convert you? I can't believe you didn't bring him back to us. And their answer was brief. Their defense was to the point, and they simply said this: never a man spoke like this man. That's Jesus. Never a man spoke like this man. The Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount are a great testimony to the power of Christ and the wisdom of God and his mastery of just communication itself. And I want us to look at that tonight. I like to imagine things. I'm kind of like out there sometimes, and I'll bring up these scenarios to my wife, and I'll say, "Hey, Kim, what if this?" And she'll just say, "It's not going to happen." So I don't even want to entertain the thought. But I'm one of the guys that like to entertain the thoughts. You know, I imagine, what if this happened and that happened, and what if we could go back in time and hear Jesus preach? Man, wouldn't that be great? I would love that. There's so many things that I would like to know about and to understand more fully. And again, I like sci-fi. My wife does not like sci-fi movies. And I like those like Svengoolie, B movies, sci-fi, cheesy sci-fi. And you remember H.G. Wells' Time Machine. You know, he creates this time machine, and it's a chair, and it has this circle behind him and a lever in the front. And he can pull this lever forward or backwards and send himself through time. What if we had one of those time machines? And what if you were allowed to go to anywhere in time and visit a speech? Anywhere, anytime, where would you go? You know, I thought about that as I was leading up to this lesson, and I tried to think of things. And, you know, there are some history buffs, and they might have said, well, man, I'd shove that thing back to 1863, November. And I'd like to see that Abraham Lincoln deliver that Gettysburg Address. That would be really neat. Or somebody might say, well, if I could go back in time and just be amazed at a speech, I would probably go back to 1912 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and hear Teddy Roosevelt. Wait, nobody's thinking that, are you? You don't know what I'm talking about. But let me tell you, because this was an amazing event. This was an amazing speech. I would love to have witnessed this, because it's just hard to believe that it happened. But Teddy Roosevelt was running for his third term as president. He'd kind of fallen out with the Democrats, and he had become the candidate for the Bull Moose Party. And he was speaking in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and right before he was to speak, a saloon keeper who had been following him for weeks, had finally gotten close enough, 5 feet from him, and pulled out a .38 revolver and shot him in the chest. They immediately took him down and disarmed him and whisked him away. And you would think that Teddy Roosevelt and his handlers would have whisked him away to the hospital. But he said, no, I came here to deliver a speech. He had a 50-page speech folded in half in his coat right here. And he had a glasses case that he held his glasses in. It was in his suit jacket. And it did go through 100 pages and through his glasses case, but it did penetrate his body, and it actually penetrated his lung. And as he got up to speak, he just pulled his jacket back and said, please be quiet. I don't know if you know this, but I've just been shot. And I have a speech to give, so I need your attention. And he said, if you think this could hurt me or harm me, it takes a whole lot more than that to kill a bull moose. And he went on and talked for 84 minutes with a bullet in his lung. Would that not have been amazing? I mean, to witness that. Listen, if something like that had happened to me right before I got up to preach, I'm going to the hospital. Somebody else can preach. But, no, seriously, if I were given the opportunity to go back in time, I wouldn't even think about stopping anywhere until I got to the first century. I would love to have heard Jesus preach. Jesus, as we've said and as we've read over and over through the years, Jesus was the master teacher. You know, there are 24 times in the gospel accounts where the Bible says people were amazed at Jesus. They were just flabbergasted, astonished. 24 times it's recorded for us. And some of those are the same events, but they want to get across the idea that people were astonished at Jesus. 3 times in the book of Mark, it says that they were astonished at his miracles. But you know what? 7 times in the book of Mark, it says they were astonished at his words. I find that hard to believe. I mean, to witness a bona fide miracle, and then that was pretty amazing. And then to hear him speak more than twice as many times, it's recorded that they said, wow, this is incredible. Not what he did, but what he said was incredible. People hung on his every word, according to Luke chapter 19 and verse 48. Jesus, he had a way of reaching out to us and touching us on the inside. It was deeper than this superficial thing. He got us at the core of who we are and caused us to do some reflection and some soul searching. He discomforted our thoughts. We sat there and felt conviction if you heard Jesus preach and teach. And to those who were smug and self-righteous, he was able to cut through that and reveal that in a person really easily. Jesus peppered his sermons with stories, great stories that were compelling and that all had a point that brought people back to God. They weren't just stories for entertainment's sake. They were stories to help us to see and to understand God and to understand their plight more perfectly. Jesus, when he preached, would make difficult demands, but he would show compassion to people who were trying to obey those commands. He wouldn't lower the standards, but he would lift people up as they fall short and fell short of those standards. Jesus would rock people's boats with insights that they had failed to consider before. And it may have changed their whole worldview, and it may have been very disconcerting because, I always thought this, and now Jesus came along and said this, and that's a difficult place to be in. And Jesus sometimes, especially and maybe only with those smug, self-righteous hypocrites, he could speak with fiery condemnation. Jesus, he lived 2,000 years ago, and his sermons are still known today. Tim recited by memory the Sermon on the Mount, and they're not only heard and memorized, but they're lived out in the lives of his disciples. So here's what I want to do tonight. I want to look and see if we can grab some things from the text that help us to understand what made Jesus such an amazing speaker. What made Jesus come away after people had heard him, they come away and say, "We have never heard a man like this before. We're astonished at what we just heard." Well, here's the first thing, and this is stated in the text explicitly. In Matthew chapter 7 and verse 29, as you come to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, you have the statement that is made that he spoke not as the scribes or the chief priests, but as one who had authority. Jesus spoke with authority. And that makes him different from what, and the contrast is, here's how Jesus spoke, here's how they speak, and Jesus was different because he spoke with authority. But listen, if you think what that means is just having an air of self-confidence and getting up and spouting off stuff and sounding like you really know what you're talking about, that's not what he's talking about here. You don't think those scribes and chief priests and you don't think they spoke with an air of confidence? Do you think that what that verse means is when the scribes taught, they would say, "Well, seems to me, I'm not really sure." I don't think that's at all how they came across. In fact, in John, when those guards came back and said, "We have never heard a man like this before," they said, wait, are you kidding me? Which one of us have gone and followed after Jesus? They set themselves up as a standard to follow. They thought a lot of themselves. They basically said to these guards, "What are you doing following him? Not even we have followed him. If we haven't, you shouldn't have." Oh, they had an air of authority about them. They spoke, I'm sure, very confidently about the things that they believed. But that's not what it's about. It's not about the air of confidence and authority. It's about the reality of it. Jesus spoke the truth, and that set him apart. And not only did Jesus speak the truth, but he embodied the truth. When I think of Jesus speaking the truth, I think of the statement that was made in Matthew chapter 22 where the scribes had tried to set a trap for him. They had made plans. How many times do you think they had done that? His ministry, throughout his ministry, these guys are behind the scenes just trying to trip him up and to expose him as being mistaken at some point or another. He never made a mistake. He was always on the side of truth. No one could ever contradict what he said and said, "You're wrong, you made a mistake. You made an error in your calculations and in your understanding." Never did they do that. And do you know how frustrating that must have been to them? My wife and I, we don't watch TV hardly at all. Andy Griffith, we watch Andy Griffith. And we watch old movies. We like, Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart and those kind of movies. And we like to look at, and Kim is really good at this. She'll pick out characters and say, "Oh, you know who that is? They played in something else." And I'll say, "No, they didn't. That's not her." And she'll say, "Yes, it's her." "No, I don't think it's her." "Well, it is her." And so I'll say, "Okay." And I'll just kind of slowly reach over and grab my phone to look it up. And I look, and she's right. And so I just kind of try to slide it back. And she'll say, "Who's right?" She saw me do it. And do you know, it's every time, she wins those things and I'm wrong. Don't you think those Pharisees and scribes and Sadducees and chief priests, don't you think they felt like that with Jesus? They get together and plot to trap him in his words, and never once were they able to trap him. He was the master teacher. But not only trap him in his words, he spoke with authority in that he was the embodiment of what he preached. The truth that he preached. Everything he said, he lived. There was no, look at TV today, look at the news, and nearly every week, every month, somebody's fired or resigning from a job because there's some immoral conduct in their life and there's some behavior, and let a person run for a public office and they start searching and they pull out these skeletons from their closet. They couldn't do that with Jesus. He didn't have any skeletons in his closet. He had no shameful activities. Nobody coming out of the past to say, "Oh, I remember when." He was perfect. And so you have a man who always spoke the truth, and he always lived the truth. That's really hard to contend with if you're trying to undermine him. But Jesus had even more than that. And I think it's those three-legged stool, if you will, that made Jesus have the authority and set him in contrast with the teaching of the scribes. And the third one is that he had power, authority. He could perform miracles to bolster what he has said and what he's lived. I couldn't help but think a number of times this week of Luke chapter 7. This past week was pretty devastating in Tennessee. A lot of people lost their lives. A lot of members of the church lost their lives. One of my best friends in college lives in Cookeville, Tennessee, and that's where they got hit the hardest. We graduated together from Freed-Hardeman, and his daughter, his only daughter, and her husband and their 2-year-old baby were taken in that tornado, killed. And I talked to my friend, and my wife just said a little bit ago, sent me a video of him being interviewed on the news, and he's lost his daughter and his only grandchild, his son-in-law, and he's devastated. And it's hard for him to speak the words that he spoke, but he spoke of hope and comfort. And the other day, my wife and some ladies from Carnes, the congregation where I preach, they went to UT Children's Hospital, and there was a little girl there that had been injured in the tornado. She had to have brain surgery, and her parents are there, and they had a horrific ordeal. And man, if you could just go and do what Jesus did in Luke chapter 7, he came across a funeral procession of all things. A widow. She's already suffered the loss of her husband. And now she has suffered the loss of her son. And they're carrying this casket. It's an open casket. And they're carrying it through the streets. And Jesus reaches up and touches that casket. And the young man sat up and was given back to his mother. Wow. Can you not imagine the amazement? You see, Jesus, he spoke as one who had authority, not as the scribes. They couldn't do that. Number one, they couldn't teach the truth without being contradictory at times. And they couldn't embody the truth. They all had skeletons in their closets. They've all made mistakes. And they certainly didn't have the power of Jesus. And that, I believe, is what those guards are talking about. Nobody has been like him before. This man is different. He's not like you. Another thing is not only his authority, but when you read the Sermon on the Mount, man, he turns social norms on their head. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever considered how radical the teaching was of Jesus? How unconventional he was in the things that he said? And how challenging this sermon is to the person who says, okay, I want to be a follower of Jesus. What he calls men to do is completely contrary to the way most people think and most people live. In Matthew chapter 20, the Bible tells us, Jesus said, this is the way it's going to work. Chapter 20, verse 16. If you want to be first, you need to be last. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. That's not how we live. Man, I can tell you that for a fact today. I was getting on 2 airplanes to get here. And I find it amazing whenever it's time to board, and people maneuver and knock each other over, and like the front of the plane is going to get there before the back of the plane. It's we all have assigned seats. We're all leaving at the same time. So why all the maneuvering to get first? It's ridiculous. You see, but it's ingrained in us. We've got to be first. That's the thing that we have to do. Do. Jesus said, it's the person who can give up first that will be first. He says later in that same chapter in verse 26 that the great ones in my kingdom are those who serve and are not the ones who are served. Do you know how different that is? That's not the way this world operates, but that's the way that Jesus called men to operate. And that is memorable. Those kind of statements give hope to those who can never reach the top of the pile. They're just ordinary people. And Jesus is giving hope to people who are just ordinary, everyday people like you and like me. Luke chapter 14 and verse 26, Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, you have to hate your mother and your father. That's not the way people think. You have to love them less than you do me. Love somebody who's not family more than my family. That's what Jesus called. In Matthew chapter 19, sell all you have and give to the poor. You remember the rich young ruler who came to him. Sell all you have. Do you not know we've got a rich man? Perfect convert. That's the kind of guys we need to be disciples. He's rich, he's young, he's a ruler. We've got influence and money and resources. And Jesus says, get rid of everything you have, and you can be my disciple. That's not how people think. You see, Jesus was amazing because he turned social norms on the head. Tim mentioned this earlier, but you know, that old expression, Jesus was able to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. He did that. He had the ability to get inside of us, whereas most people just kind of look at the outside. 6 times in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus challenged truisms of his day. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. He wasn't conventional. A third thing that I think makes Jesus such an amazing teacher is that, well, he knew how to hold the attention of those who listened to him. Listen, no one could sit through a sermon of Jesus and be bored. I mean, unless you were asleep. But if you were awake, he would either offend you, or he would challenge you, or he would make you uncomfortable thinking about the improvements that you need to make with your life. I think that's one of the great problems of preaching today, actually, is that we don't make people uncomfortable. We can preach sermons that elicit no response. There's nothing to think, there's nothing to do. It was a nice talk. Jesus didn't give nice talks. He challenged people to be different, to change their lives, change the way they think, change the way they behaved. Sometimes it would rub people the wrong way. Jesus wasn't offensive to hurt people's feelings. He wasn't trying to rattle cages. But listen, you can only tell the truth, and it's up to the person. How are you going to receive that truth? Some people have made him mad, so much so that they wanted to kill him. Others, it made him uncomfortable. Wow, what am I going to do? He said this, and I see it in myself, and that's not a good place to be. You got to make some resolution there and change your way you're living. Here's what bothers me about some preaching today, because I don't think it's like Jesus in this respect. We have tried so hard not to be offensive that I think we've watered down sometimes the gospel of Christ to where it doesn't have any convicting power to it. We're afraid of hurting someone's feelings. And I'm not for offending people, and I'm not for being ugly and unkind and sarcastic and all those kind of things. But listen, there is an offense to the gospel of Christ that cannot be packaged like something you put on a shelf and say, I'm one of those gullible people. You market it just right, I'm going to buy it. Put it in a nice package, you get my attention. I'm one of those people. You can't sell the gospel like that, because there is an offense in the gospel that you cannot get rid of, and if you get rid of it, you don't have the gospel anymore. Here's the offense, Galatians chapter 5 and verse 11. It's the cross of Christ. Do you understand what the cross of Christ says? It says you are a sinner, and you can't dress that up and make it look pretty. It calls you out. It says that you are undone and that you need a Savior. You're helpless by yourself. And when we remove that, we don't have anything else to talk about. We've removed the power of the gospel. So we need to get back to preaching like Jesus. Tell the truth and tell it in love and say it in a way that it discomforts those who are comfortable and it offends those who have hard hearts. Jesus, he used hyperbole a lot. In the Sermon on the Mount, he used hyperbole. And hyperbole grabs your attention, it pulls you in. You're not going to go to sleep on Jesus because he was constantly using these figures of speech it makes you kind of go like this. What did he say? Did I hear him just say that? Did I hear him right? Statements by Jesus like, Matthew 5, if your right eye offend you, pluck it out. Or if your right hand causes you to offend, cut it off. What? What did he say? You heard what he said. And now you're pulled in and you got to think, what does that mean? What is he saying? Sometimes when we hear passages like that, here's our first inclination. Well, now that's figurative. It's not to be taken literally. Well, of course. But it does mean something. What does it mean? That's what Jesus did with people. He pulled them in with these reaching statements and caused people to think. It's harder for a rich man to go to heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, Mark chapter 19. It'd be better to have a millstone tied around your neck and be thrown into the depths of the sea than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. You can just go on and on. Jesus used these extreme illustrations to grab our attention, to wake us up and make us think. Jesus also asked questions. You know, there are 14 questions that were asked in the Sermon on the Mount, 14 of them. And questions are better asked better spoken than written. Because have you ever been in a situation where somebody asked a question and it was like a pregnant pause at the end of it, to the point where it almost becomes uncomfortable? You're sitting there and you're thinking, and you're wishing, I wish he'd just move on. You know, this is getting uncomfortable. I wonder sometimes if I would love to have heard him. We don't read like Jesus probably spoke. When we read, we just go right down through it. But do you think that Jesus probably didn't take advantage of the timing of speech and ask questions like in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 4, how can you say to your brother, here, let me get that speck out of your eye when you have a beam in yours? Do you think he ever waited to let that sink in, that question? He was one who asked questions. Sometimes you can look at words and you don't come away. You've got to have more than just the words. My son, Matthew, sometimes he was closest in age to my youngest daughter, and when they were little, they'd fuss with each other, and every once in a while, they'd have to apologize. And, I could write about that and say, Matthew and Emery got into it again tonight, and I told Matthew to apologize, and he said, I'm sorry. That sounds like one thing, but if you could have heard how he apologized, it's not what you might have read. Jaw clenched, teeth never open, I'm sorry. That's kind of how it was said. You see, that's totally different than what you read, than what you heard. And I think of no better illustration in the life of Jesus when it comes to that passage in Matthew where Jesus says, let the little children come to me. And haven't we all read that or heard preachers use that? And they say it just like that kind voice, let the little children come to me. You know, the disciples had tried to push these kids away. They're bothering our master. And Jesus said, no, guys, let them come. That's not what it sounded like. If we're going to represent Jesus, not only do we need to represent him truthfully to the words that he spoke, but in the way he spoke them, if we're to have a better understanding. Mark records for us that Jesus said, with great indignation, let the little children come to me. Now, Listen, have you ever been really mad? Go upstairs, you've told your kids 5 times, pick up their toys, and you go upstairs, and you say, pick up your toys. I don't think so. It's as, pick up your toys. Jesus said with great indignation, let the little children come to me. Boy, that puts a whole different spin on it, doesn't it? Jesus, by asking questions and by using language, was a great teacher. And also, Jesus, well, he was a storyteller. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 34, the disciples of Jesus said, you never tell us anything unless it's in the form of a parable. I don't know who started it or when it started, but somebody has come up with this idea that you're either a preacher or a storyteller. No, he's not a preacher, he's a storyteller. You do realize that we say all the time, Jesus is the master teacher, and we need to be like him. Did Jesus tell stories? Not for the sake of stories, but for the sake of illustrating truth and making truth memorable. I asked the students in the School of Preaching last week in preparing for this lesson, I said, guys, Sermon on the Mount, how many illustrations do you think Jesus used in that sermon? 5? 10? And then somebody said 15. Would you be surprised if I said 41? 41 illustrations to help drive home truth in one sermon. Listen, everybody loves a story. When you preach and you use an illustration to bring people to the text or to explain a text, people's heads immediately raise up because stories are compelling. When I was 10 years old, we had a gospel meeting in Chester, West Virginia. My dad was the preacher there. And I'll never forget because the preacher got up, walked up to the pulpit, had an old alarm clock in his hand. You remember the kind that you wound up and it had the bell on the top and the little hammer that went in between? You know what I'm talking about? Had one of those and stuck it right there on the pulpit, right by the microphone, and he said this. I asked Frank, my dad, to set the alarm on this and not tell me for how long he said it. It could go off in a minute. It could go off in 2 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour. But I'm going to preach for as long as that alarm is on. And when that alarm goes off, I'm done. I mean, mid-word, mid-sentence, I am finished whether I'm finished or not. His sermon was on the return of Jesus. And when Jesus comes back, it's done. There's no finishing up things. And so he began the sermon by saying, extending the invitation. Here's what you need to do to be saved. He got all that out of the way because that alarm is going to go off and he's not going to be finished. Man, as a 10-year-old, I sat there. I watched that clock. I was hanging on every word he said. And then when that did go off, that ringer thing right by the microphone, I nearly jumped through the wall. I mean, it scared the life out of me and everybody else there. That was 48 years ago. And I remember who preached it. I remember where I was sitting. I remember what the sermon was about. And it's because that illustration helped to make that point about the urgency of our obedience and the return of Jesus and how that when he comes back, there's no time. I remember it to this day. That's the power of illustration. And that's why Jesus was a great storyteller. He spoke in parables constantly. We need to preach more like Jesus. So at the end of the day, If I had a time machine, man, I wouldn't waste time on incidental historical figures, as great as they may have been. I'd throw that lever back to the first century, and I would sit and listen to Jesus, my Creator and my Savior. And I would be spellbound and probably discomforted in the fact that I could hear what he was saying, but realize how far short I fall of what he wants me to be. But I would also find comfort in the fact that Jesus lifted people up. He showed kindness and compassion to those who were seeking God. To those who were smug and self-righteous, not so much. He didn't have much appreciation for that. But if you were a sinner struggling against sin, trying to do right, you're the kind of person that Jesus was interested in because you're poor in spirit. And that's what we need to be today. I want to go to heaven more than anything in the world. And if I think I have it all under control and it's all me and it's all my accomplishments, man, I am missing how undone, and it makes me understand why God must hate pride. Of all things, for us to cop an attitude like we have arrived when God in heaven is looking at us with all of our imperfections. Can you not imagine how disgusting that must be to him? There's no place for pride. We need to humble ourselves. If we heard Jesus speak, and we do as we open his word, I too would say, if I could take that time machine back, I too would say, and I think you would too, never has a man spoken like this before.